which is a statement by the Vice President of the Commission and High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, a statement on the war in Gaza Strip and the need to reach a ceasefire, including recent developments in the region. As you all know, Vice President and the High Representative is not present here because he is sick. So he will be represented by Commissioner Lenarčič, who I will now give the floor to talk about this point and then for the next debate. Thank you.
Mr. President, honourable members of the Parliament, for more than 4 months, I have been calling the attention to the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, where around 30,000 people have been killed and more than 1 million are displaced in Rafah. A recent health report from Johns Hopkins and the University of London predicts that more than 60,000 civilians will die unless there is a ceasefire and a massive surge in aid very soon. After almost 5 months of war and destruction, our focus must be on achieving an agreement for an immediate end to fighting, to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe, save lives, and free the remaining 130 hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. 26 of our member states share that call. In unison with most of the international community, we have urged Israel not to advance on Rafah. It would have humanitarian consequences of incredible proportions. Over 1 million Palestinians that have been displaced there and have nowhere else to go. Under these circumstances, the work of the United Nations, including UNRWA, remains crucial. UN Secretary General Guterres and Commissioner General Lazzarini are taking the Israeli allegations against UNRWA staff very seriously and have taken immediate, decisive measures. We must recognize the high-risk environment UNRWA operates in and cannot resort to collective punishment or contribute to the further humanitarian collapse in Gaza, considering UNRWA's literally vital role for the people in Gaza. But UNRWA is also essential for the stability in the region. Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and in the West Bank. In line with EU values, and while we are working constructively with UNRWA on the reinforcement of their internal controls, an audit carried by EU-appointed experts, and the vetting system for their staff, it remains of crucial importance to provide UNRWA with adequate funding. A funding gap would have catastrophic consequences. We have to be clear. There is simply no substitute for UNRWA, now and for the day after. Individual accountability must be ensured, but collective punishment cannot be the answer. The situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is equally concerning. Demolitions, settlement construction, restrictions on movement and access, as well as settler violence, have all surged since 7th October. On the adoption of sanctions on violent Israeli settlers, we have an agreement at 26. But as you know, we need unanimity to adopt EU restrictive measures, similar to those imposed by the United States months ago. Some member states have introduced national entry bans. We will continue to work towards a coordinated approach on this issue. With Ramadan approaching in 2 weeks' time, there is an acute risk that the situation could get further out of hand in the West Bank and in the region if we don't act decisively. For months, we have been urging Hamas to release the hostages and for Israel to protect civilians, increase humanitarian access, seriously confront settler violence, release essential revenues withheld from the Palestinian Authority, and desist from actions that risk aggravating an already explosive situation. We have also urged both Hezbollah and Israel to contain the dangerously spiraling violence across the Israeli-Lebanese border. There has been no substantial progress. Meanwhile, the current escalation has been a political windfall for extremists across the region who thrive on polarization and misery. All Iranian-backed militias are active, from Yemen to Lebanon. I'm worried about possible miscalculations that would trigger a wider conflict. All diplomatic channels must be used to prevent further escalation, be it in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or the Red Sea, where freedom of navigation is threatened by Houthi attacks on commercial vessels. The EU is playing its role by deploying a naval operation called Aspides to escort and defend commercial vessels. It is the 7th EU operation that High Representative Vice President has launched during his mandate, and it is a new illustration of the importance for the EU to develop its military capacities. But we must move beyond treating symptoms to treating the cause. Israelis, Palestinians, and all peoples of the region deserve to live in security, dignity, and a stable neighborhood. But we all know that there is only one viable and sustainable way to achieve all these objectives: a safe and secure Palestinian state next to a safe and secure state of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Janez Lenarčič. I will now give the floor to the speakers of the several political groups. We will start with the first round of speakers, beginning with Antonio López Istúriz White.
Thank you very much, Chair. If my calculation is right, we are holding the 6th debate on Gaza, and we have had 2 resolutions in 4 months. If anyone is taking good note, I think that we are breaking all the records in this Parliament. We did not break these records for Ukraine in 4 months, neither for Bosnia. No, we didn't. No, we didn't. Yes, not in 4 months, my friends, because this is not about ideology. I know that some of you are looking for votes in the next European elections, but this is not. This is about the sufferance of the Palestinian and the Israeli people and how we can mediate on that. And then I have to hear the High Representative attacking again the President of the European Commission. Why? Because we have elections in 2 months? Is this the role of the High Representative? Is this the role? People of good, that there are many in this Parliament, that they have voted in favor of 2 resolutions in this Parliament, that we were the first to talk about the humanitarian process, that we talked about the ceasefire condition to the release of hostages and the end of Hamas. We have been first in everything. We will continue that line. Yes, yes, you will lose the elections, my friends. The polls are showing you are not reaching the European population. And unfortunately, because of the reaction against you, they are turning to the other side. And you will not be there in the next Parliament with all your rhetoric, because you take this ideologically not from the humanitarian approach that this question needs, and Europe at its centre to be the mediator between the parts. As long as you don't understand this, then we cannot be part of the solution. And that's what many of us we would like to be. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado. Depois do PPE, tem agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Ince.
Colleagues, as long as the bombs are falling down on Gaza, of course, we need to continue debating it, even if it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times. The debate needs to continue, and more than the debate, the actions must be put on the table, because to be honest, I am furious about the lack of actions from the side of the European Union. Time is running out and innocent Palestinians are losing their lives. 30,000 people. It's not just a number, but real individuals of flesh and blood. Yes, Israel has the right to protect itself against the terrorist activities of Hamas. However, taking the lives of innocent individuals is not a form of self-defense. More than 70% of the victims are children and women. Do we in this Parliament and the EU truly believe in upholding humanitarian principles and international law, or do we only advocate for their application when it suits our agenda or when the victims are deemed to be the right ones? At this moment, in Gaza, newborn babies are being punished simply for being Palestinian. They don't even have the chance to open their eyes before they are tragically deprived their lives by the Israeli bombings. Our true humanity is being tested right now. If you want to examine your own humanity, especially on the conservative side of the spectrum here, consider reversing the roles and imagine how you would respond if Palestine were the aggressors and 30,000 innocent Israelis were the victims. I consistently advocate for Israeli safety and security every day during the whole year. I also always stand up for the safety and security for the Palestinians. It is unfortunate that not all colleagues in this Parliament are capable to do the same. Colleagues, as ordered by the International Court of Justice, we in the S&D group urge Israel to refrain from acts under the Genocide Convention, prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to genocide. And colleagues, we are also grateful for the incredible work UNRWA is doing through ensuring humanitarian aid to civilians. EU and our member states must continue supporting UNRWA. And finally, we need an immediate and unconditional ceasefire right now to save lives. We cannot stand by in this Parliament and the European Union and watch. We can't be implicated in grave humanitarian violations. Silence is compliance.
Muito obrigado. Segue-se agora pelo grupo Renew.
Thank you very much. Now on behalf of Renew, Ms. Woutmans.
Collega's, meneer de commissaris, ik had wel meneer Borrell verwacht hier. Maar goed, ik ben...
Thank you very much. We were expecting to see Mr. Borrell here, but colleagues, often we are critical of the Commission's foreign policy positions, but member states and the European Parliament finally have a strong position apart from Viktor Orban, but we're used to that. Fortunately, Europe is united around a ceasefire and for more humanitarian assistance for Gaza, for all hostages to be released by the terrorist organization Hamas, and to prevent more civilian casualties. But the question, colleagues, is how can we stop Netanyahu from putting into place his Rafah attack plan, which would be an ordeal for more than 1 million inhabitants in Gaza? Europe needs to ensure that Israel respects the opinion of the International Court of Justice and protect civilians, because this ruling is binding. We are a union of values. As Team Europe, we need to exert all of our diplomatic influence to ensure that this war ends. Otherwise, we won't be a proper European Union.
Obrigado. Próxima intervenção pelo grupo dos...
Thank you very much. The next speaker, on behalf of the Greens, Mr. Solé. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In Gaza, almost 30,000 people killed, mostly innocent civilians. How many more lives need to be destroyed until this bloodshed finally ends? I say it again, the atrocities committed by Hamas do not justify the massacre of civilians in Gaza, nor the collective punishment to which, as a matter of fact, its population is being subjected to. And things can only get worse if Israel carries out the ground invasion operation in Rafah, where 1 million Palestinians are cramped with nowhere else to go. Let us listen to the ICJ. The risk of genocide is plausible if these large-scale operations do not stop and if access to humanitarian aid continues to be hindered. The provisional measures ordered by the court are binding. However, the reality is that in February, compared to January, humanitarian aid into Gaza has been reduced to a half. This is just shameful. Speaking of aid, to all those governments who have decided to suspend funding to UNRWA, I ask them, what exactly is the viable alternative to immediately replace UNRWA's operational capacity? They know the answer as well as I do, none. So what sense does this decision make? Let all the necessary controls be carried out. Let all the necessary measures be taken, but don't asphyxiate UNRWA, because this will have immediate and further tremendous consequences on the population. This tragedy must end now. We need an immediate and permanent ceasefire and the release of all hostages. Let's hope that the negotiations underway will lead to this result. The sooner the better.
Muito obrigado. A próxima intervenção é do grupo dos conservadores.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on behalf of the ECR is Ms. Kanko.
De ECR-fractie wil de onmiddellijke vrijlating.
Thank you. President, the ECR group wants the immediate release of all hostages and the dismantling of the terrorist group Hamas and a ceasefire. Of course, we all want humanitarian aid to reach Gaza, as long as this assistance is not rejected by Hamas. I am appalled by the attitude of UNRWA. Yesterday I listened to a mother in Geneva. Her son was kidnapped lifeless and taken to Gaza from the music festival by an UNRWA staff member in an UNRWA jeep. All of this can be found on video. Do we want to pay for this? The UN needs to take a key role now. People think it's legitimate for an EU member state to suspend their funding of UNRWA pending the conclusion of investigations. But a thorough review of UNRWA could eventually lead to being replaced by the UNHCR and other credible UN agencies. We demand full transparency and full control on EU funding for UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority. We need minimum respect for taxpayers. And we should not forget the pain of this mother and the death of her son.
A próxima intervenção é do grupo ID.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on behalf of ID is Ms. Bonfrisco.
Commissario Lenarčić.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Lenarčić, colleagues, the involvement of UNRWA in the Hamas attack on the 7th of October is a terrible reality, a reality which is magnified by the conflict and the fact that there are operative cells which are underground in Gaza. So the Jewish state of Israel, the value of life, the protection of this particular state, and the need of this state to be able to defend itself, well, it requires the respect of all, and it requires, of course, respect of international conventions, but we also have to make sure that that state can defend itself. Now, Commissioner, you're worried about Ramadan. Now, in Gaza, there is no structural separation between the civil and the military. And let me give you the response. How do we deal with this? Creating multiple martyrs for a cause, that's part of their program, that's part of their way of doing things. It's the inability of Hamas and other Islamic organizations to be able to use any other instrument other than terrorism in order to promote their particular agenda of anti-Semitism. This is despicable.
Intervenção de Manon Aubry, do grupo.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Aubry on behalf of the Left.
Chers collègues,
members, as we speak, 1.5 million people know that they will die in Rafah if we do nothing. Israel is going to launch a massive land operation, having carpeted the area with bombs, whilst half the population is there following Israel's instructions, and the conditions there are awful. This is going to happen in the next few hours if we can't bring Netanyahu to see reason, and it's going to be carnage. Mr. Borrell has said it. The Gazans aren't dying themselves. It's because Netanyahu is killing them. It's because we supply military supplies to Israel to kill thousands of Palestinians. They're dying because the EU prefers to close its eyes to this and to renew its association agreement with Israel for the sake of a better profit. They're dying because the EU is not able to apply the ICJ's ruling and the measures that it outlines against Israel to stop the genocide. People are dying because members here on the right of the House refuse to help them. They're dying because members here prefer to sanction this humanitarian disaster. They're dying because some here prefer having blood on their hands. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Dou agora a palavra à deputada.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Laura Ferrara, non-attached.
Thank you very much. The International Court of Justice has requested that the Convention on Genocide be respected. This is something that involves our conscience as well and our international responsibility. So I think it's very important for us to understand that there are forced movements of people that have led to death because of lack of medical supplies, of food, of water. And we have numerous people which are suffering, which are dying because of this. UNRWA has already made its particular statements with regard to the consequences of the 7th of October attack. And if something is not done right now, the catastrophe will be total in nature. It's very important to use all instruments that are available, sanctions in order for reciprocal respect to be put in place for Israel and for Palestine as well. What we have to have is the recognition of two sovereign democratic states. A two-state solution is the only possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker. Now we have the group's speakers. Lucas Mandel first.
President, dear colleagues, time and again during our plenary sessions, the representation of the very citizens of our very European Union, our High Representative, the Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, does not show up. Again, he does not show up. Otherwise, he would know about the decisions of this very Parliament on the current Middle East crisis. And the decisions were always on behalf of the EU citizens, on the side of Israel, our strong partner, the only democratic rule of law based in the region, defending itself, defending also us against terrorism and terrorist threats all over the world, confronting the Mullah regime in Tehran of Iran, which is threatening all the world, and otherwise he would not be able to say what he actually said in a recent interview in the newspaper El País, that our Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, would have represented anyone but herself with her completely pro-Israeli position and visiting Israel in the most crucial days. Actually, our Commission's President represented what the people of Europe think in their majority, represented by this Parliament, which has decided into that manner and direction. And this is what the High Representative and Foreign Affairs Commissioner should be aware about. I disagree on a lot with our Commission's President when it comes to bureaucracy, to the inside, when it comes to the new era of prohibition, to the inside of the European Union, but to the outside, Ursula von der Leyen is strengthening Europe, and Josep Borrell is unfortunately weakening Europe. Only remember him also his visit to Moscow before the current Russia aggression.
Thank you. Thank you very much, colleague. You've got a blue card. Lucas? You've got a blue card. If you want to answer, it's from Abir Al-Fanani.
Thank you so much for taking this blue card, colleague Mendel. I have a question for you. You said that Israel was the only rule of law state in the MENA region, thus making it clear that Israel has to follow international regulation and international law. Where is it your breaking point? How many more Palestinians have to be killed? What other atrocities can Israel do? Where is your personal breaking point to see that this, what is going on, is not anymore self-defense, it is something else? What is your breaking point, Mr. Mendel? How many more Palestinians have to die? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. My personal position and my policy is especially for demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. After dismantling Hamas, which is taking hostage not only Israeli citizens, but the people of the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians themselves. After dismantling Hamas, there must be demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, observed by Israel, but not only by Israel, by others. We then need civil society, we need education there, we need fight anti-Semitism, we need economy which will be capable to help itself, not be dependent on all the world's aid all the time. This is what will be needed in the area. Or in other words, is it possible to respond to a blue card? Or?
It is possible
Okay.
within the time limit.
I hope we will continue our debate because a parliamentary debate is always worth it. Thanks for the question again. I could make the most important point at least.
Thank you very much. As you all know, there are allocated times, so people have to respect the allocated times so that our debate can continue normally. So the next speaker now is Brando Benifei. You've got the floor.
A Gaza si sta usando.
In Gaza, we have famine. Humanitarian aid is not entering. There is much less than in February, than in January. 30,000 civilians have died, the majority of which men and women. UNRWA cannot be left without resources. This humanitarian disaster is in the making. It's there. We have to do something. Netanyahu has said clearly there will no longer be a Palestinian state. We can draw what we want from those statements. Now, it's important for the international community to take action, to offer hope to those who are suffering today, convene a conference on peace, a united Europe against this violence. We have to act right now in order to stop this horrific massacre.
Muito obrigado. Próxima intervenção.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Abia Al-Salani. You have the floor.
Do you want to use your time, speaking time? So if not, I kindly ask you to leave the podium so that the next speaker can intervene.
There are no more words to speak about what's going on in Gaza, Mr. President of this session. There are no more laws to break. There are no more appeals that we can do to what's going on. The hypocrisy is obvious. Our collective humane has failed. We said that we won't fail, but we're failing again. Human rights have a skin color, and the darker you are, the less human rights you have. We have been tried to be silenced. They have tried to make us look like anti-Semites. They have tried to make us look like we don't care about the safety of the Israeli people. All of that still to make it possible to kill more Palestinians, unfortunately. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Próxima intervenção.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Kira Peter Hansen.
Børn er sult. Familier spiser græs.
Children are starving. Families are having to eat grass. And those that are fortunate die. These children are suffering. Mothers are not able to breastfeed because they're not being fed. More than 10,000 children have been killed and many more will be killed. Whole families have been killed. And many people no longer have children, mothers, fathers or siblings. Many people have died. Many people have to suffer. Lots of people have been traumatized for life. And the Israeli hostages are still remain hostages. We've seen rulings from the ICJ as well. And Israel has responded with more bombs and even less access to humanitarian aid. Here in the EU, we need to advocate for international law, and we need to move towards a two-state solution. We cannot see more civilian victims. Palestinians and Israelis have the right to live in peace. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Segue-se agora a intervenção de...
Thank you very much. Now, Bert-Jan Roysten.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Beste collega's.
Thank you very much. Release of the more than 100 hostages in Gaza must be the top priority of the ongoing negotiations. Increasing humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza is also of great importance. A temporary pause in fighting can certainly help in this regard. But it is up to Hamas to take responsibility for the sake of the people in Gaza. However, this has been lacking for decades. Let's be realistic. As long as Hamas continues to prioritize destroying Israel, there can be no permanent truce. Even if Hamas were defeated, the spirit of Hamas lives on. That problem must be addressed at the root. In this, the EU also has a responsibility. As long as Europe continues to co-finance Palestinian textbooks full of Jewish hatred, and as long as it pays UN bodies where terrorists work, a sustainable solution is not in sight. Thank you.
Blue card. I wonder if you want to respond from our colleague Sophia Anveld. I see you want to respond.
Ja.
So, Sophia, you've got the floor.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you very much. Colleague Royson, you said only when all Hamas fighters are destroyed, but Hamas fighters will continue to exist. The endless violence against the people of Gaza, this is not legitimized by all of this particular situation. Is it not something, is it something that you can continue to label as legitimate? Hasn't it been overdone? I said that in Gaza and in the Palestinian areas, we have a generation which is growing, which is being indoctrinated by hatred for Jews. This is something that we have to bring an end to. As long as Hamas still exists, there can be no sustainable peace in the area. I hope from the bottom of my heart that some sort of solution will be found. And we're speaking about the release of hostages by Hamas, perhaps some sort of limited ceasefire, but some sort of long-term sustainable peace in the region? No. Hamas has to disappear for all of that to take place.
Anders Primdeel Vistisen.
Thank you. Now Anders Vistisen, please.
Burde ikke bruges til finansiering af islamisk terror.
We can't have EU money funding Islamic terrorism. It sounds simple, but it's not, apparently. Not here. In March 23, UNRWA took 600 million kroner, but we know that that organization now participated in the Hamas terrorist attack. Not just welcomed it, but participated. The support that we have given to Palestinian society has actually created more radicalism. It's supported terrorist organizations like Hamas. And that money was used to plan the attack and to train the terrorists for that attack and other activities aimed at destabilizing the region. And we must say stop now to that. Stop. Danish and European taxpayers' money should not fund terrorism. Which has created problems in the Middle East. We have to stop our monies funding terrorism permanently.
Actually, we've got 3 blue cards, but I can only allow one. And the first request is from Margaret Auken. You've got the floor.
Anders Vistisen, har du nogensinde været der?
Mr. Vistisen, have you ever been there? Have you seen what UNRWA actually does? Building schools, emergency aid, all sorts of things. And all the things that Israel should be doing because it's the occupying power, but doesn't do them. There is evidence that there have been a few black sheep, but that does not mean that it's true that what Israel says, that UNRWA has been transporting missiles in its ambulances. That's been shown to be a line. It's cynical of Israel, and it's damaging the life of thousands. You apparently don't care about the life of thousands of people. I wonder if you've got a better solution than UNRWA.
Tusindvis af millioner bor der trods alt ikke i Palæstina.
Hundreds of thousands. Well, the proof against UNRWA is not new evidence and are not individual cases. There were employees that carried out terrorist attacks. There were tunnels under their offices. And there are school books that got subsidies but promote hate and violence and fundamental Islamism. That is not appropriate for the UN organization. The UN organization is supposed to promote conciliation, and the global order should be protected by the UN. I'd like to see this dealt with at the UN General Assembly.
Nosso colega Manu Pineda.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pineda has the floor now.
Thank you very much, President. "29 days have passed since the ruling of the ICJ, and more than 4,000 people have been killed since the 29th of January, since the ruling was interested. 24,000 people, correction. And a countless number of women, children and old people who are dying because of diseases, because humanitarian aid isn't reaching them. And it's Israel that you are defending here, and they are preventing this humanitarian aid from reaching them. What is the EU doing to ensure that the interim rulings by the ICJ are being complied with? Nothing. What is the only measure that's been taken? That is the accusations of an unreliable entity, Israeli intelligence, saying that of the thousands of people working in UNRWA, a dozen have been involved in the attacks in Israel on the 7th of October. And many countries, most countries in the EU, have already withdrawn funding from Israel. We've seen how here the far right is asking for UNRWA to be replaced by another agency. And the Cont Committee is chaired by a Zionist, and they have presented an amendment regarding UNRWA. The EU is becoming an accomplice of Israel in the application of the final solution against the Palestinian people. Is this what we want? Do we want to be part of this genocide? Do we want to be complicit in that genocide?
Thank you, colleague. You've got a blue card, actually. Two, but I'll give the... Do you want a blue card? Do you want to respond? Sorry, so we've got a blue card first from Michaela Sojdrova. You've got a floor.
Děkuji, pane kolego.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Thank you very much for accepting my blue card, dear colleague. I think you very often mix up causes and consequences in your speech. You say that we, the European Union, have done nothing to help the victims of violence. Well, I would like to ask you, what did Hamas do? What did Hamas do to stop the violence? Why did Hamas not release the hostages? That would be the end of everything. Thank you.
Well, if we were in a meeting with Hamas, you could ask them, they could respond to that. But we are in the European Parliament, and the responses need to be provided by the European Parliament. Hamas know what they are doing, but they are offering the release of Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners in Israel. There needs to be an exchange here. You know, I've heard a lot of people talking about anti-Semitism, but the worst example of anti-Semitism since the beginning of the end of the Second World War is the genocide that terrorists in Israel are doing against a Semitic people, which is in Palestine. And do you want to continue? Do you want the situation to continue?
Thank you so much. So now I will give the floor to our colleague Dino Giacoso.
Il 19 ottobre sono
On the 19th of October, we said here in the plenary, we condemned the Israeli acts just a couple of days later, we had members of the European Parliament just standing silently and not responding to the thousands that are dying there. And the same thing a couple of days later. And now anybody who has criticized the government of Netanyahu is being called an anti-Semite. Now, I think anti-Semites, what is this? How can you say that? Condemning, I have condemned the violence of Hamas. Cannot be called an anti-Semite on those particular, with having made those particular statements. I think it's quite clear that we have no civil conscience. It is Europeans that ought to stand at the side of children in Gaza who are victimized in this particular situation. They are part of this world. They are living creatures that have to be respected. It is absolutely key, absolutely imperative for us to condemn this horrific massacre.
David Lega.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is David Lega.
Yeah, of course.
More down with the... Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner, and Mr. Borrell. I do hope for your swift recovery, and I want to address you online since you're not here, because today I wanted to talk to you about trust. Because without trust, there can be no ceasefire and no lasting peace. Yesterday in Geneva, I met the mother of a young Israeli man murdered by Hamas on October 7th. A young man whose corpse was then taken hostage to Gaza by an UNRWA employee in an UNRWA car. And this isn't just her mother's story. It's all on video. I saw it yesterday and I will never forget it. When it comes to UNRWA, how could the EU ever even consider business as usual? You, Mr. Borrell, criticized President von der Leyen for visiting Israel after the attacks. You've said you fully trust UN leadership to get to the bottom of alleged UNRWA complicity in Hamas terrorism, and you've said that major donors who have suspended funds to UNRWA, including my own country, Sweden, have fallen prey to emotions. What will it take for you to understand that your trust is frankly irrelevant if UNRWA loses the trust of parties involved? And that whether you like it or not, donor countries are parties involved, and so is Israel. UNRWA has failed to keep the trust of all its partners, and no organization is irreplaceable. EU aid to Gaza can and must go to more responsible, more neutral, more trusted partners who have shown their capacity by serving millions elsewhere. And honestly, Palestinians in Gaza deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, you've got a blue card. You've got a blue card. Actually, you've got two. I can only give one. And the first request, let's see, it's from Malin Bjork. Swedish should be fine.
Du säger att UNRWA inte ska få en spänn.
You have said that UNRWA should be punished, but without UNRWA, Palestinian children will starve. Not your kids, not mine, but Palestinian children. How do we distinguish between different human lives? Why is a Palestinian life not worth anything? Why should bombs be dropped on the Palestinians? 30,000 have already died, most of them women and children. Where is the line for you? When do you say stop this killing from Netanyahu? We have to work for peace and cohabitation. The extreme right-wing Israeli government is not doing that. Why do we support the progressive powers in Israel that would like to see peace? Thank you, Marlin. I have supported those progressive powers in this parliamentary term in Israel, but they have said that UNRWA promotes hatred. They have these school books school books that show terrorists attacking Israelis, but even before the attack took place. How many more tunnels and cables should we let them build together with UNRWA? Where do you draw the line? How many crimes need to be committed before you lose trust in UNRWA?
Very much. So the next speaker will be Isabel Santos. Assim que estiverem criadas as condições.
As soon as the technical arrangements have been made, I give the floor, Isabel Santos, the floor.
Tempo. Somos vencidos pelo.
Thank you. We are exhausted and we don't have the words to describe this situation. In the Gaza Strip, there is no longer any safe place. Humanitarian assistance is not reaching the people. There is no health care. The only certainty for Palestinians is death for those people living in the Gaza Strip. Those that have survived Israel's bombings, the situation, UNRWA is the only source of hope for Palestinians within and outside the Gaza Strip. We can't leave them without any resources. The European Union needs to provide assistance without delay and without restrictions, including those planned for this week. It's important that we have this assistance in place because it's the only way we will save lives in the Gaza Strip. We cannot tolerate the atrocities which continue to be committed in the Gaza Strip and the breach of the recommendations made by the International Court of Justice, breaches by Israel. We need to think seriously about the possibility of suspending the association agreement between the EU and Israel. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Bernard Guetta.
Mes chers collègues, nous n'avons pas.
Members, we're dealing with not one emergency, but two. The EU has to arm Ukraine and rearm itself, but it also has to make its voice heard in the Middle East, where it has little political weight, but it has enormous economic weight, because it's the largest trading partner for Israel and the largest aid donor for Palestine. Europe is first to defend the two-state solution. However, the European Union, we are only speaking. We're not taking action in favour of peace. And worse still, our passive stance means that we're being accused of taking sides with the stronger party, Israel, against Palestine. All of this should mean that the Union takes up the gauntlet of making peace through two-state solution. As soon as the fog of war has cleared, we should use the levers that we have, the leverage that we have, namely our trade agreements with Israel and our aid to the Palestinian Authority. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra Ana.
Thank you. Ms. Neumann has the floor.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen,
Colleagues, what's happening right now in Israel and Palestine is inconceivable that human beings can do that to each other. Every lost life, every destroyed family, horrible. That's why it is absolutely necessary to have an immediate ceasefire and an unconditional release of hostages and allow for humanitarian aid to arrive there. I think, indeed, pressure has to be exerted on the actors. But what is our role here? This conflict in our countries, in our schools, it's absolutely necessary for us to build bridges, express empathy, feel for others, and understanding and sympathy for those suffering. But as things are, no lives are being saved. As a woman, 102 years of age, a survivor of the Holocaust, she said, there is no Christian blood, there is no Jewish blood, there is no Muslim blood, there is only human blood. And human blood, unfortunately, is flowing far more than it should. Thank you.
We've got a blue card from Uzma Demirel. You are allowed to refuse, so we continue with our debate. Next speaker, Herman Tertsch.
Yes. Thank you very much. It is a shame that Mr. Borrell is not here, because he would have said that we need to disarm Israel and boycott Israel, and like with the Berlinale this Sunday, which is almost like a mini Kristallnacht. That is what we're seeing on the left. We're seeing Israelophobia and protests that are saying from the river to the sea, and that means that Israel would disappear. These are the protests that the left is encouraging across Europe, and especially, of course, in Spain with members of the government. It's a shame that the EPP agreed to changing this title of the debate, taking out UNRWA. UNRWA, we've known for decades that they have been complicit in acts of terrorism in the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian territories, and they're acting together with Hamas. But there is a key point with the ceasefire. There won't be a ceasefire until they end Hamas, because Hamas puts everything at risk. They need to put an end to Hamas, release all of the hostages, and then we can talk about this ceasefire, which shouldn't be here in this title, and that the EPP, unfortunately, agreed to include in the title. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra Nikolai Willumsen.
Nikolai Willumsen, please.
Gaza er katastrofal.
The situation in Gaza is disastrous. Children are starving. Women are getting caesarean sections without anaesthetic, and schools and civil institutions are being bombed. This is collective punishment, and that is crime, a war crime. The Israeli government is now guilty of being accused of genocide. 30,000 Palestinian civilians have already died. If we don't act now, history will judge us. Netanyahu is not listening to what we have to say, to our concerns. We have to force Netanyahu to respect international law. We must act. Stop export of weapons to Israel. Suspend the association agreement with Israel. Boycott Israeli settlers' products. We need an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and a durable two-state solution so that Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace side by side.
Muito obrigado. Próximo.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Mario Furore.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. High Representative Borrell, in Italy, students are on the streets because they want an end to the war in Gaza. The police has taken action, and there is suppressing of those who are calling out for peace. And I simply want to say that Europe has to unite in the name of peace. It will not work any other way. Europe is at risk of losing its credibility if it doesn't unite and work in a concerted fashion for peace. We see acts which border on genocide, which are essentially genocide. And it's now absolutely important, it's absolutely necessary for sanctions to be levied, for this massacre of Palestinians to come to an end. And nothing has been done by Europe. This all has to be taken before the courts.
Today.
Our next speaker is Hilke Bentele.
Thank you, President. Plenary after plenary, we talk about the Gaza situation, but we're not learning the lessons. We shouldn't stop talking. We should really focus on a stronger foreign policy position of the EU. One thing, the fate of hostages is being forgotten, and I warned about this. The family of around 130 Israeli hostages for months have not had any signs of life of their children and babies. And what are we MEPs doing? What are you doing, Mr. Borrell, if you are listening to this debate, to ensure that these hostages are not being forgotten? This war was caused by this mass murder. We should not allow this to be a success. And there's also the issue of a general attack on the President of the Commission. But unlike Mr. Borrell, Ms. von der Leyen has a huge amount of confidence in the international community. Ursula von der Leyen's decision to focus on values and focusing on Europe's security is the right one. Does Mr. Borrell think that in the Middle East, controversy will actually achieve things rather than policy? No, this is not right. It's good that we have Ursula von der Leyen, who is the face of the EU, and not Mr. Mr. Borrell. Thank you.
Colleague Hildegard, you've got a blue card. You've got a blue card from Evian Inshir. You've got a floor.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And you are totally right. We need to talk about the hostages as we need to talk about all the Israeli hostages, as we need to talk about all the 30,000 innocent Palestinian people, children, women, people that have been deprived their lives. I have, though, one question to our colleague from the EPP. The EPP and the Conservatives and the far right constantly attacks the Palestinian Authority, attacks UNRWA, attacks those actually that in some way are or ensuring to do what they can do to demand a two-state solution and peaceful settlement on this conflict. But where are your evidence when it comes to the accusations toward UNRWA, for example, the 12 UNRWA staff? There are no evidence along with the accusation against the UNRWA staff. Where is the understanding that, for example, the tunnels under the UNRWA headquarters?
Thank you. Thank you very much. The question is well understood. You've got the floor to respond.
Ms. Inge, I don't know if you listened to my speech. I didn't talk about UNRWA at all. Sorry, then let's talk about what I've said. And the most important thing is that we have a stronger role as the European Union. And sorry, what I have seen in both regards, with regard to the situation in Gaza with the civilians and with regard to the hostages, we are doing not enough, and this is what I'm calling for.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra Alex Hagius Saliba.
Colleague Saliba.
Thank you, Chair.
The right of this House is talking nonsense in the face of this genocide. A large proportion of the victims are children. And they're not dying because they've been bombed, but they're dying.
And UNRWA, that is the only association that is given no food. This is a genocide in front of us, and the majority in the European Parliament is washing their hands with these innocent victims. We can see so many people being attacked. We can see hospitals that are destroyed, victims on stretchers and on pavements. Is this humanity that we believe in as members of the European Parliament? We shouldn't accept that the European project should dirty its hands with the blood of other people that are committing this genocide. I'm really ashamed.
Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you very much. Now the floor goes to colleague Barry Andrews.
President, Commissioner and colleagues, I want to talk today about evidence. There is sadly widespread evidence of starvation in Gaza, and especially in the north, and especially among children. There is evidence of deliberate obstacles being put in the way of the delivery of humanitarian aid by the Israeli authorities, described yesterday by the UN rapporteur on the right to food as a war crime. By contrast, according to Sigrid Kaag, in her presentation to the Foreign Affairs Council here in the EU, there is no evidence whatsoever to back up the claim by Israel that 12 UNRWA staff took part in the horrors of October the 7th. Equally, there is no evidence to support Israel's claim that 10% of UNRWA staff have links to Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. EU member states have ignored this paradox, and the ECJ has directed that immediate and effective efforts be made to deliver aid. Since that judgment was delivered, aid has fallen by half. So I implore Member States to make decisions, not based on punitive political considerations, but on evidence, and I implore the Commission to disburse in full its commitment to support the unreplaceable and heroic work of UNRWA. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you very much. Now the floor goes to colleague Sarturi.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, members. The bombing in Gaza is leading to despair. You're all talking about the attack on Rafah in the future, but actually it's already happening. They're already bombing the civilians that they displaced. Humanitarian aid is being stopped by Israel, not by Egypt. And we are hesitating to support this aid getting through. We are basically promoting famine. There's less humanitarian aid and more bombing since the ICJ ruling. Now, we have a particular responsibility here because this is the week that the EU is to pay its donation to UNRWA. So the question is whether or not that aid is paid or not. Now, it's not, I don't think, it shouldn't be our role to do that. Mr. van der Leyen needs to commit this week to pay the humanitarian aid because there is no other solution if we want to support the women, the children, the sick and the injured. We have to pay our aid. Will we be up to our historical responsibility? Will we shoulder this responsibility? Nothing else mattered. It's all Sunday speeches and Instagram posts. This is the only thing that matters. Commissioner, can you commit today in front of the Parliament to make this payment?
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Brudzinski.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, President. Nothing justified the suffering of innocent Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the suffering of children, the elderly, women, people with disabilities. That suffering is something that is being imposed by the military forces of Israel. The military operation has been criminal in nature. However, let's not forget that Hamas attacked Israel, and that was also a criminal act. They kidnapped civilians, made human shields out of them, and that has escalated the conflict. But let me just bring to your attention something that hasn't been mentioned in this discussion. This attack of Hamas on Israel was on the birthday of another criminal, and who is using this conflict to their own political ends, a criminal that revolts the young people on our streets in Europe, and who is trying to play Europe off against the US. That criminal is Mr. Putin.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra Malin Björk.
Thank you very much. Malin Björk now has the floor.
Tack. Det pågår formligen en slakt av kvinnor, barn, civila sedan snart 5 månader tillbaka.
So, children, women are dying. Their blood is flowing. If we don't do anything, if we fail to do anything for them, then we become essentially somehow complicit in these particular activities. We have to say no to what is going on, to what Netanyahu is doing. We have to stop the delivery of arms. We must provide humanitarian aid, and we must provide financing for UNRWA. The Swedish government has ceased paying anything to UNRWA. That's terrible. This is simply something which is causing hunger, suffering, terrible pain. Is something which is not bearable any longer. We must call for people to be helped to adopt policies which will bring an end to this suffering, that will promote coexistence and peace.
Tem agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. Our colleague, Madam Pietikäinen, has the floor.
I'm just wondering, how will the history see us, and how will the history judge us with this Gaza crisis? EU is losing very fastly its moral grounds and moral leadership in global scheme. So we are just justifying a genocide in front of us. We justify war crimes because even the war has the rules how to act. We justify an Israeli invasion for a long time before this crisis. How could we close our eyes? And with the UNRWA, as said, there has been claims, but all people and organizations are innocent as long as proven different. And none of these claims so far has been proven to be right. Then what about if we would talk about Ukraine and Russia, like we talk with the Palestinian-Israeli war and crisis? How would that sound? And, dear colleagues, Commission, how would it sound if we would start talking about Palestinian crisis like Ukrainian war?
Muito obrigado. Próximo orador.
Thank you very much. Matthias Nemetz is our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear colleagues, dear Commission Lenarčič. Today's debate on the situation in Gaza will last about an hour. In this time, about 15 people, including 6 children, will be killed in Gaza. At least 35 people will be injured in this time. Approximately 40 Israeli bombs will fall on the already devastated territory of Gaza, about 12 buildings destroyed. This is a horrific image of the life in Gaza every day, every hour for 44 days. The Israeli military is working against international law and is hurting civilians. This is a big problem. The decision of the court in Hague says that Israel needs to ensure humanitarian aid to reach Gaza and that they need to stop murdering civilians. However, nothing is being done about it. Dear colleagues, there is no time to hide from the truth and no time to delay. We need an immediate solution. The war needs to end now, and humanitarian aid needs to reach Gaza immediately. The hostages need to be freed, and prisoners in Israel need to be freed as well. the EU needs to continue financing UNRWA. I would like to welcome the decision of Slovenia from last week, which decided to continue funding UNRWA further, and I hope other countries will do so as well. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Maria Soraya Rodriguez Ramos.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, I was on the border with Rafah, and what we heard there and what we saw there was the horrors of a genocide. Then, if that's not the case, then we need to invent a new word to describe what's happening there. But the International Court of Justice has said it's plausible that a genocide is being committed there, and the interim ruling on Israel are binding. Can you say whether the Commission is considering any measures to ensure that Israel complies with the interim rulings of the ICJ? The false accusations on UNRWA are part of the Israeli government's strategy to avoid and to prevent humanitarian aid from reaching Gaza. Commissioner, do you know if there's any proof of the latest accusation by Israel as relating to involvement of UNRWA workers? And Commissioner, could you say whether you confirm that the UNRWA is irreplaceable, and whether the 82 million euros will be dispersed, that should be dispersed? Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. Our colleague D'Amato now takes the floor. What's happening right now on the Gaza Strip is unprecedented. 30,000 dead, civilians, thousands of children, injured tens and tens of thousands, schools destroyed by bombs, hospitals destroyed as well. It's a massacre. And the right of defense of Israel, I think it's gone way beyond that. And the moment has come to understand that what's taking place in the Gaza Strip is a genocide, nothing less than that, a bloodbath. It has to come to an end right now. We need a sustainable peace. The moment has come for that to take place right now. UNRWA has to be active there. Without them, the people cannot survive. Europe has to act right now. History will not pardon this indifference which Europe has up until now expressed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam Demirel has the floor.
President.
Thank you, President. For years in the EU, we've been saying that we're looking at a two-state solution, but we've done nothing for a sovereign Palestine in the past. Most countries haven't even recognized Palestine. Now, for the last 4 months, we have a brutal war against Gaza. As we speak, death, suffering and destruction are running their course through Gaza. For months, the Netanyahu government has been making unacceptable statements. Palestinians are being compared to animals. Netanyahu said there will never be a sovereign Palestine. That is unacceptable. Double standards in Europe are also unacceptable. Maus Enon is an Israeli who lost both his parents and has appealed in a statement for peace to US and Germany and said, please don't send us weapons, send us peace, because weapons are being used by this government to dehumanize Palestinians, but also to remove our democratic rights. What is our answer? What is Mrs. van der Leyen's answer? It's offering solidarity with the ultra-right government in Israel.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra
Thank you very much. Madam Šojdrová now has the floor.
Děkuji za udělení.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, It has been almost 5 months since Israel was attacked by Hamas, 5 months of violence and thousands of lives lost. We all know that Israel has a right to self-defense against the terrorist attacks by Hamas. Appeals to peace are certainly well placed now, but what is the response by Hamas? When are they going to release unconditionally hostages? Because they took the refugees, nobody else. And it is they who torture those hostages. How long are they going to take all Palestinians as their hostage? The fate of Gaza is done by those who turned Gaza into a fortress of Hamas. And I ask, how long are Palestinian women and children going to have to suffer under the reign of Hamas? And the international efforts for peace and for the release of hostages are certainly well in place, but the hatred by Hamas towards Israel is preventing any agreement. Can we expect Israel to give up just like that, give up its defense and be attacked? Israel has responded to violence and to hatred towards Israel. And if you ask the citizens there, and I agree with them, certainly we should provide humanitarian aid, but let's not send money to terrorists. And UNRWA is not the only humanitarian outfit in place. I would like to thank the International Committee of the Red Cross for their assistance. So if humanitarian aid, then only through recognized international organizations. Thank you.
Blue card. I wonder if you want to respond. It comes from Ana Miranda.
Galician. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Muito obrigada. A senhora afirma aqui.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, this lady has told us that the problem in Gaza is X, among a series of different things. It is one of the problems. But there is no humanitarian aid going there. That I simply want to remind you of that particular fact. We have to remember the various resolutions of the United Nations. Do you understand that Gaza, the schools there are funded and provided for by UNRWA? They've been destroyed by Israel. You have to go and visit those particular schools. You have to visit the various institutions in Gaza that have been set up by UNRWA in order to understand what the situation. So this is not something of the, this is something totally unacceptable. We're saying we're speaking about human lives.
Paní kolegyně, vy jste
Colleague, you haven't asked a question, but you've asked me to visit Gaza, and you've named a number of issues. But I called the reason, I have named the reason for those problems. It is because Hamas turned Gaza into a terrorist fortress. It is very sad, but women and children will be shot at by those who want to do away with terrorist violence. I have been to Israel. I know it is a democratic, peace-loving country. They are very close to us, and they have the right for self-defense.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra Maria Arena.
Maria Arenas has the floor.
Thank you very much. The International Court of Justice is taking measures to confine what is being done to protect Gaza, and yet Israel's just mocking what's being done. They're stopping humanitarian aid for the Gazan population. Israel is contravening international law in the eyes of everyone, even when we're talking about the risk of genocide. And the European Union watches, or worse, some member states and some members of this House are ready to stop the funding, the only organisation which is trying to stop this genocide on the ground, UNRWA. Have we lost our minimum level of empathy and humanity in Europe? I wonder. This isn't an ideological debate. We're talking about thousands of people, women and children, who are dying of hunger, dying of cold, being operated on without anaesthetics. Have we lost our humanity? I put that question to you. It's time for the Commission to act. It's time to finance UNRWA, to in fact bolster UNRWA, to give them more resources. It is time to act so that this ceasefire comes about. It's time to act to send a message to Israel vis-à-vis the association agreement and say, no, we are not prepared to accept anything and everything. There is time to act before it's too late.
Muito obrigado. Tenho a palavra Salima.
Thank you very much. Salima Yembo has the floor.
Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. After 4 months, we're talking about the same thing again. Thousands of hostages, almost 30,000 Palestinians dead, many of which women and children, millions of Gazawis who have disappeared, and many displaced persons. 300,000 Palestinians are suffering of malnutrition, and there could be mass famine. It is urgent to agree on a ceasefire. I think there is a majority backing this. We need humanitarian aid to get to its destination and to release hostages. We need to oppose ourselves to a ground offensive in Rafah because this would lead to unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. In eastern Jerusalem, the Israeli authorities have razed houses to the ground. This violates international law, increasing the risk of regional escalation. We have to make sure that we don't have everything exploding in the region, especially with what's happening in the Red Sea and the threat to Egypt. We have to make sure that we look at the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians and Israeli security, and we need a two-state solution. We have to start working on this. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Ana Miranda is the next speaker.
Comisario, dígale al señor Borrell que precisamos más.
Commissioner, please tell Mr. Borrell that we need more international pressure on Israel to stop this genocide and to stop things getting even worse in Gaza. Recently, I was at the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and Gaza with other MEPs. Among ambulances and tanks, you can see the blockage of the border, more than 2,000 trucks with humanitarian aid waiting to go across when 1 in 6 children are suffering from malnutrition in Gaza. It's immoral that you'd have trucks like this. Look at this, trucks waiting at the border when you have children dying of malnutrition.
Any signs cannot be
No problem. Vimos el centro logístico.
We saw the Red Crescent Humanitarian Center, where there's aid coming from 21 international agencies, 40 countries, food, medicines, etc., shelter, all blocked at the border. After seeing Palestinian children in Al Arish Hospital, I'm really speechless. All of the agencies say that the situation is about to collapse because of the speaker is cut off.
Intervention. Thank you very much. Next speaker, Señor Urbán Crespo, por favor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Genocide, occupation, ethnic cleansing. Israel is organizing a new Nakba with the complicity of European governments. Yesterday, I came back from the Rafah crossing. Just a few meters away, there were people crowding the area. There should be trucks, so many trucks going through, but only 5 are allowed through every day when they need 600. Israel is using hunger as a weapon of war. We have to put an end to this complicity. We need to take specific action to put an end to these barbaric acts. You know, Commissioner, that we need to have an arms embargo and to suspend the association association agreement with Israel. What are we waiting for? Do you want this genocide to go further? Commissioner, also, what will the European Commission do when it comes to UNRWA funding? Will it disperse what is necessary, or will it contribute to be seen as criminals, as Israel wants it to do? Now, history is staring at us and time is running out.
Speaker, colleague Mr. Kanev, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, any normal person can clearly see the horror in Gaza and in Ukraine. Everybody wants to flee the horrors of the Middle East. But in the framework of this debate, nobody has mentioned how this is meant to be done. And we have to admit that we don't have an answer to how this should be done. Each clique has its own horrific logic of hate. But there's an obvious step that can lead to peace, and that's dependent on the aggressor themselves. And that is a step that hasn't been taken. Those who started the war in Ukraine, those who started the war in Gaza, the political organization of Hamas, they do not recognize the right of their opponents to exist. Putin won't recognize Ukraine and Ukrainians, and Hamas refuses to accept the right of Israel to exist. And there's a mantra from the river to the sea, which is being reiterated in the universities of the West. So when it comes to the recognition of the right to life, that is something that would apply to the citizens of Ukraine and Israel too.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, colleague Sánchez Amor, por favor.
Gracias, Presidenta, Comisario.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner. Israel's the scale and lack of proportion in the military response shows that it's just impunity. It's totally unreasonable. Israel's method has killed 30,000 people to neutralize, that's the word they use, neutralize 6,000 terrorists. They've killed 5 civilians for every terrorist. In other words, if a terrorist kidnaps 6 people in a European city, a lot of people might say, well, we should kill the lot of them. That appears to be ethically acceptable in this case. But, of course, I'm giving you an example of European women and children. But, of course, Palestinian women and children is different. This is a rotten matter ethically.
Intervelt, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Every person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Palestinian people no less than Israelis. And that is the principle that we should all defend, including the right which is now absent. Europe is an ally of Israel, but that does not mean unconditional support to a far-right government. Because what we see today is not self-defense, but vengeance. And for some, even the stated objective of ethnic cleansing. Removing aid from the Palestinian people at this point is a certain and horrible death. Funds for UNRWA have been withdrawn on the basis of allegations which have not been proven. But even if they were, punishing innocent people cannot possibly be just. Thousands of children killed, maimed, traumatized. How can that be just and proportional? An allegation of atrocities committed by Israeli forces have not led to withdrawal of support to Israel, including the continued arms supply. Resuming funding for UNRWA, immediate and permanent ceasefire, the return of the hostages and a two-state solution are the only way out of this horror. The only way. Thank you.
Mrs. Intervelt, will you accept a blue card from colleague Mrs. Melchior? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Intveld. You mentioned the right-wing government of Israel, led by Netanyahu, has been in power in Israel for many years. What has the EU failed to do to actually apply pressure to different Israeli governments that have failed to support a two-state solution? What should we be doing now to actually ensure that we find not only a ceasefire, but a permanent peace for both Israel and Palestine? Thank you.
Well, where to start? First of all, we haven't seen much action from the side of the European Union, probably none, in order to, let's say, rein in the extreme actions of the government. I have seen no action or hardly any action to support, to aim for a two-state solution. I mean, virtually nothing has been done. And at the moment, there is support for the two-state solution and the Palestinians, but it's all very, very limited. Some member states have actually withdrawn their support for UNRWA. That's why we're here today. I mean, the first steps haven't even been taken. So it's about time that we do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Kelly, please.
I have emphasised at every juncture that the attacks launched by Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October were reprehensible. The vast death toll of civilians, many of whom are children, the extensive destruction of property and infrastructure, and the displacement of 2 million people far exceed what could be considered Israel's right to defend itself. The Irish government, and indeed Irish MEPs, have repeatedly called for a ceasefire, but day by day we see the horrors continue. Where does this all end? Whatever post-conflict Gaza looks like, the EU should be united in calling for the Palestinian people to have a voice and a vote in what that looks like through a revitalised Palestinian Authority. Otherwise, extremists will fill the void. Until now, we have seen no plans for what happens next, but Netanyahu's government has now rejected any internationally imposed solution, including the prospect of the recognition of a Palestinian state. Plans to build thousands of new settlement homes in the West Bank fly directly in the face of the two-state solution. How can we, as an EU institution that supports the two-state solution, not point out this glaring hypocrisy? Palestinians have the right to life, not just to live, but a life. Let's give it to them.
Thank you. Next colleague, Mrs. Yoncheva, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen. The conflict in the Gaza Strip is something where we would like to see respect of all parties involved, but recent developments have only made sufferances worse. Innocent people caught in the crossfire. We should recognise the legitimate rights of both Israelis and Palestinians, Palestinians and Israelis, to live in peace and security. And I applaud the efforts of Vice President Mr. Borrell for trying to resolve this complex issue. His commitment is very important, and as is international cooperation to try and resolve this ongoing and long-term conflict. But his commitment is not everything we need. We need more than that. We need to see that the two-state solution is the way to go. Europe needs to take the initiative to revitalise the initiative to push for the two-state solution, and we have to establish a roadmap and start to work on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next colleague, Mrs. Malinko. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President, and thank you very much, Commissioner Lenarik, for being here for this important debate. We've spoken a lot of words about this conflict for years. Now we must stop just speaking and actually show some action. Ahmed al-Ghafari lost 103 family members in a military attack hitting 2 of his family's houses. Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old girl, was killed when she was trying to shelter in a car being attacked by Israeli military. We need to stop this conflict. We need a ceasefire right this moment in order to save human lives. This is a humanitarian crisis that is caused by war, which is why the ceasefire is so urgent. But once we have the ceasefire, we need to apply the necessary pressure to Netanyahu. Netanyahu, I am afraid, will try and continue this conflict in order to stay out of prison. Because as long as he's Prime Minister, he can stay out of prison. And we may not allow this to happen. We must have a two-state solution as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Sokol, please.
Dear Madam Chair, Commissioner, dear colleagues, in our resolution, the European Parliament was clear about the situation in Gaza. It demanded a lasting ceasefire under the condition that all hostages are released and that the Hamas, the terrorist organization, is disbanded. It is clear that there is no safety of Israel without a complete destruction of Hamas. In the Hamas documents, they still invite to killing Jews wherever they are. In other words, Hamas must disappear, together with all those that support it. Unfortunately, many on the left still try to put the sign of equation between Israel and Hamas and the crimes committed. Hamas terrorists are still perfidiously hiding behind women and children. They use them as a human shield, contrary to any laws of war or international humanitarian law. It is no longer just a problem of Israel. It is a factor of instability. And in Europe, in the heart of our cities, many people spread anti-Semitism. We must stop equating the actions of Hamas and stop relativizing their crimes in Europe.
Colleague Mr. Zorinho, please.
Senhora Presidente, dirijo-me a si felicitando pela exposição.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to congratulate the High Representative for the very lucid positions that is adopted on the ongoing crisis in Gaza. I would condemn what's happening in the field. Israel's legitimate right to defense cannot override Article 2 of the agreement between the EU and Israel. I trust that we'll make progress. But let's be clear here. A ceasefire alone will not solve the problem. It's essential that in parallel with that, we have the necessary investigation into inappropriate behaviour by some UNRWA staff, and that we strengthen the monitoring system so that UNRWA can continue to have adequate funding and support to guarantee its irreplaceable humanitarian work in Gaza. Thank you.
Mr. Georgios, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Netanyahu is not only bulldozing Gaza, but also our strategic interests. He is splitting the Democratic Party in the United States, increasing the chances of Trump being re-elected. And with Trump in the White House once again, NATO's cohesion will be jeopardized. The more victims in Gaza, the more this is playing into the hands of Putin from many points of view, including war crimes. He is destroying Ukraine, and we are destroying Gaza, and we are remaining indifferent. In the global south, there's rejection of Netanyahu, and they feel that European governments are tolerating him, and therefore the rift between the European Union and the global south is getting bigger and bigger. With Netanyahu's policy, the conflict will extend into time, and this is particularly negative for us. We have to react to the policies of Netanyahu, not only because he's corrupt and unethical, but also because he's causing us significant harm.
Mrs. Walsh, the floor is yours, please.
Over 30,000 lives have been lost over the last 143 days. The citizens of our European Union have spoken continuously, sharing their activism on the streets, speaking out on their social media platforms and leading. And they've been looking for you and I, their political leaders, particularly in the Commission and Council, in the European Union, to lead them. And what are we doing? The consistent and brutal violation of fundamental rights needs to end, and it's obvious to us all that the violence will not end without USA, EU and UK intervention. In the name of the Palestinian women and children killed, we demand a permanent ceasefire. In the name of the Palestinian women and children killed, we demand immediate humanitarian assistance, in particular food and medical supplies. In the name of the Palestinian women and children, I re-echo the Irish Government's call to immediately review, may I add, end the EU-Israel Association Agreement. We are witnessing a genocide. We must lead with our hearts, our humanity and...
Thank you very much. Next speaker, colleague, Señor López, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, President Commissioner. Over the last 4 months, there have been more murders of journalists and medical staff of the United Nations in the Gaza Strip than at any other conflict in the past. The devastation of the Gaza Strip is total. 25,000 people killed, 1% of the total population. Access to basic services for all of the civilian population has been cut off. Not only that, but now hunger is being used as a weapon of war. 500,000 of citizens of Gaza live in a situation of serious malnutrition. In the face of this totally unacceptable and mind-blowing panorama, we demand an immediate ceasefire, the liberation of hostages, the fulfillment of the measures laid down by the International Court, including stopping export of weapons to Israel, and the imposition of a true political two-state solution, which is going to be the only viable solution in the region.
Next speaker, colleague, Mr. Borrell.
Spoštovane kolegice in kolegi, tragedija, ki smo jo priča v Gazi,
Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing a tragedy in Gaza, and there's no military solution that's going to help. Certainly not for the Palestinians and not for the Israelis either. Given all the suffering, it is time to find a solution. We should have a ceasefire that's brought into force, and we need to provide help and aid to Gaza. And we have to restart international negotiations to try and apply the principle of the two-state solution according to the 1967 borders. That means there needs to be a change on both sides. There has to be a stop to the occupied territories and building of settlements, and the Palestinians have to leave violence behind. We cannot allow Iran to help out in this way. It's certainly not going to help the Palestinians in the longer term, not the region. And I think we should have faith in political application.
Moretti, the floor is yours.
Sono state uccise più di...
More than 30,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip since October. We have said many times that Israel has a right to defend itself, but that cannot be tantamount to vendetta, siege, and international law, humanitarian law breaches. This cannot become a genocide because even war has its rules, and the Netanyahu government has trampled on all of them. We have to ask for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire that will allow civilians to get humanitarian assistance and that will lead to the release of the hostages in the hands of We have seen people take to the streets, but there has been violence and truncheons used against this. And this shows what the right-wing governments are doing, including Netanyahu's government. Instead of peace talks, they have been promoting hatred and intolerance. We have to have democracy and freedom, and we have to protect our values and make sure that we promote them in the world as a beacon of civilization. Thank you.
Next speaker, colleague Mr. Miller. The floor is yours, please.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Panie Komisarzu, koleżanki.
Madam President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot wait until the Israelis and Palestinians meet for bilateral peace negotiations. We can't just expect that to happen without very strong support from international institutions, hence the responsibility that weighs on our shoulders. The European Union and other institutions have a role to play in this. The International Court of Justice has laid down a ruling to the effect that Israel should take all possible steps to prevent genocide. There is reference to a possible genocide. Therefore, the responsibility on the European Union is extremely great. Preventing genocide and bringing about a two-state solution, which is the only acceptable one. Thank you.
Señor Luena, por favor.
Yo creo que este debate nos
I think that this debate will help us draw some clear conclusions. We have to demand the following: the release of hostages, and we have to make sure that humanitarian aid can go through and that UNRWA also can go through, and we have to ask for an immediate ceasefire. I think that we can, Commissioner, we can draw these three conclusions from the debate, but there are also three more key ideas. First of all, we have to review the association agreement with Israel. And if we decide to suspend the agreement, we can even adopt sanctions. So please read the letter sent to you by the Spanish and Irish governments very carefully. Settlers, we have to impose sanctions on radical attitudes. And then what is the crux of the matter? It's the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. If we really want to get to the bottom of this, this is where it all stems from. We have an apartheid system in Palestine. So I think that the EU has to strive for a two-state solution. This is the only option open to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, colleague Mrs. Olsen. The floor is yours.
The humanitarian situation in Gaza is disgraceful. People are starving and they're being forced to eat animal feed and weeds to survive. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, 12,300 children and 8,400 women. More than 70,000 people have been injured and 7,000 people are still missing. The number of civilian victims in Gaza, with a very large proportion of children, is completely unacceptable. Hamas's horrific terror attacks on the 17th of October led to Israel's disproportionate military response, and now Israel's being accused of the worst crime against humanity, of genocide. Respect for international humanitarian law is absolutely necessary. It is non-negotiable. This is the message that the EU has put to Israel again and again, and Hamas must unconditionally release the hostages. What we need now is an immediate and permanent ceasefire. The occupation that Israel's carried out has to be put a stop to, and the two-state solution is absolutely essential for long-term peace in the region.
Thank you. Next, I have 8 speakers on the KHDI list. So I will start with Mr. Zver. The floor is yours.
Hvala za besedo, spoštovana gospa predsedujoča.
Thank you very much. I would also like to echo those colleagues who are asking where the High Representative is. Where is Mr. Borrell? I've said on several occasions that I condemn the Hamas attacks against Israel, and I'm going to repeat this here today. I think that we have to focus on Israel's right to self-defense, but there is something else that is at stake, and that is UNRWA. UNRWA personnel took part in the attacks against Israel. So I am one of those who believes that we cannot continue funding UNRWA until there is a proper investigation and it reaches its conclusions. We have to make sure that this agency doesn't have ties to Hamas and that it becomes independent. And it's only when it becomes truly independent that we can do this. And the Slovenian government made a mistake, to my mind. It already provided the funding for 2024 to this UN agency. It did so too hastily. So let's shed light on what is happening in UNRWA and let's fund it only after that. Otherwise, another agency should take responsibility.
Spoštovani komisar, kolegice in kolegi. Pred natanko mesec dni je Meddržavno sodišče.
Thank you very much. Now, in the South Africa versus Israel case, the ICJ said that Israel had to adopt immediate provisional measures, and it had to also ensure that the forces didn't carry out a genocide against the Palestinians, and yet we have collective reprisals against Palestinian civilians, including children, and it is preparing for a ground offensive in Rafah. This is disproportionate. It would be a war crime and tantamount to genocide. Those who back Israel are also responsible for these crimes, and this applies to many governments who suspended funding to UNRWA, paralyzing humanitarian aid. And that is why today we are at a crossroads in history. And the EU cannot continue as a peace project without respecting international law fully and without providing humanitarian aid to Palestine.
Speaker, colleague Mr. Kelleher, the floor is yours.
There's calls in this House for funding to be suspended from UNRWA. And there's proof that maybe up to 5 people were some way complicit with the attacks on the 7th of October. Yet the Israeli Defence Forces and its government are in Gaza at the moment pillaging and plundering and murdering people, according to the International Court of Justice, according to international law, and according to a humanitarian law and just a basic human decency. And yet we have people in this House calling for funding to be cut from UNRWA that is supporting and maintaining the lives of ordinary citizens in Gaza. And at the same time, we have a trade association with Israel with favourable conditions, and nobody is questioning whether or not we should maintain that link. It is shameful that this House cannot even condemn what is happening, and then we go along and, with spite, call for the withdrawal of funding from UNRWA. We sincerely owe an awful lot more to the people of Gaza, and I hope that everybody in this chamber will support the reintroduction of funding to UNRWA so that children and those that are most vulnerable in Gaza at the moment have the basic access to humanitarian aid.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, colleague Mr. Botenga. The floor is yours.
J'ai tellement peur. I'm so scared. Please come and get me. Come and get me. Are you going to come and get me? On the telephone, a little 6-year-old Palestinian girl talking to the emergency services is terrified. In the car with a family fleeing the Israeli bombs, they crossed an Israeli tank. Her uncle was sidelined, stood in the way, but the tank fired anyway. So they're stuck in the car in the middle of the bodies of her family that had been killed. Then the call was interrupted and her body was found only a few days later. I will never forget that voice of Hint on the telephone. Her death shows in and of itself the genocidal character of the war that Israel is pursuing. And I won't ever forget either that this House, this European Union, has not called for a cease to the export of war and weapons to this area. That is shameful in itself.
Yes. Formand, og jeg vil sige, det har været en rigtig god debat i dag, hvor så...
Thank you. This was a very fruitful debate. Many have maintained the idea that the massacre in Gaza has to come to an end and that we need a two-state solution. But there is something shameful, and that is that we've heard words said about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, that is asking for aid for Gaza and is asking for a ceasefire. It's crystal clear what we need to do. It seems that this ruling is seen as just one little point in the debate. This is a very important international law binding instrument. We're talking about a huge threat. It's a huge threat and danger if we ignore the ICJ and its ruling. We have to make sure that we're not seen as hypocrites by the rest of the world. We have to take the ICJ seriously. So the EU and the member states have to respect the ruling, and my member state is not respecting it. 30,000 people have been killed, including 13,000 children, and many have not had any humanitarian aid for 30 days, according to UNRWA. The tragic death toll and results of the Israeli attacks in Gaza. We're talking about a siege, and now there might be a ground offensive in Rafah. And then look at what's happening in Lebanon. They're spreading war there. For more than 140 days of this genocide, the European Union, member state governments, and the European Parliament are disgracefully supporting the murderous state of Israel. And they are avoiding mention of ceasefire with the UK and NATO. They're preparing a military offensive in the Red Sea, which means that this could all become a powder keg. Greece is also coordinating this with New Democracy, PASOK, and other parties. But the people are supporting the Palestinians so we can stop the onslaught. Israeli occupation has to come to an end. We need an independent state. We need 1967 borders and Jerusalem as a capital.
Mr. Wallace, please.
President, over 12,000 Gazan children murdered in a few months. UNICEF warns the Gaza Strip is about to see an explosion in preventable child deaths that will compound the already unbearable level of child deaths in Gaza. We have been warning for weeks that the Gaza Strip is on the brink of a nutrition crisis. Food deliveries are drastically inadequate. UN experts said last week that Palestinian women and girls continue to be raped, tortured and executed by the Israeli military in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Women and children are being arbitrarily executed by the IDF. The Israelis are brazenly ignoring the binding ICJ court orders to halt the threat of genocide against the people of Gaza. Israel is failing to comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, and yesterday the EPP won a vote to take the reference to the ICJ ruling off the agenda. The European Parliament is engaging in genocidal denial. We are watching the total destruction of place designed to obliterate past, present and future for Palestinians. This is pure evil and a genocide.
Next speaker, Mrs. Daly, please.
Thanks, President. On the 26th of January, the International Court of Justice ruled that there is a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza. It ordered Israel to stop killing civilians. Israel continued. So the legal obligations on EU member states are very clear. The Genocide Conventions require states to avoid complicity. The EU common position on arms exports bans exporting arms where there is a clear risk they will be used to violate international law, and the UN has warned that such transfers must cease. Yet France dissembles, hiding behind secrecy and Israeli assurances, while Germany has increased its exports tenfold last year, 90% since October 7th. Ireland doesn't even ask Butcher Biden what's coming through Shannon Airport from the US on the way to the Middle East. What sort of people are ye? In 1982, arch-conservative pro-Israelis Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan stopped arms to Israel during a war. But in 2024, European Greens, Social Democrats and Liberals are arming a genocide. Shame on ye. International law and humanity requires lethal arms to Israel. Must stop now.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Pimenta Lopez, please.
Thank you, Madam President. The EU's institutions are still sitting on their hands, speaking rhetorically, despite what's happening in Gaza. This is complicity and cynicism. A case was brought at the ICJ about the risk of genocide, more than 6,000 women and children, the destruction of all of the essential infrastructure, the imposition of a criminal blockage on the border, preventing essential humanitarian aid from getting through to the Gaza Strip, more than 2 million displaced persons, malnutrition, suffering, death. We appreciate the 88 members who have supported a reinforcement of UNRWA. It's very important that UNRWA should be strengthened. The rest are complicit in this genocide against the Palestinian people. The Commissioner spoke of more than 65,000 dead, while scores of aid trucks are queuing at Rafah. What are we waiting for to strengthen support for UNRWA and to demand a permanent ceasefire and to recognise the state of Palestine? What are we waiting for?
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor back to Commissioner Lenarčič. The floor is yours.
Madam President, honourable members, thank you for this important debate. A few comments and some facts from my side. After the ICJ, International Court of Justice, issued its orders back on 26th of January, the European Commission and the High Representative issued immediately a joint statement stating that, I quote, orders of the ICJ are binding on the parties and they must comply with them. And the EU expects their full, immediate and effective implementation. I think it cannot get any clearer than that. Now let's look at those orders, but let's say one of them just for illustration. There was this order that was already mentioned by some of the members. Order to Israel to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. End of quote. Well, if anything, now, today, 1 month later, these adverse conditions of life are even more adverse than they were at the time of these orders. Pockets of famine have appeared in Gaza. Hunger is so prevalent and people are so desperate that orderly distribution of humanitarian aid in northern Gaza, for instance, is no longer possible. And some of our partners already stopped the provision of food to northern Gaza. Attacks on United Nations and on humanitarian workers in general continue. There have been so far 161 UN staff killed since 7th of October. There have been 378 attacks on healthcare, including 98 attacks on ambulances. These are quite unprecedented numbers. We also note the extensive denials of access for humanitarian missions into Gaza. We also note the increasing difficulties that UN humanitarian workers face in obtaining visas and other permits. Access to Gaza definitely is worse this month, February, than it was in December or January. Much fewer trucks have been getting through this month. So yeah, there is an urgent need for the end to fighting. And this is what 26 member states have called for. Because this would allow for a massive surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza and throughout it. And let me recall that the last, and so far the only humanitarian pause, was agreed back in November last year. EU is not sitting on its hands. EU is doing all it can. EU has allocated more than 200 million euros for humanitarian aid since 7th of October. And we are now in the process of rolling out our 125 million euro heavy humanitarian funding for this year, for Gaza and occupied Palestinian territories in general. We also continue our in-kind support. By now, we have organized 40 flights of EU humanitarian air bridge, bringing 1,700 tons of in-kind assistance for the Palestinians in Gaza. We have been all along in touch with our Israeli counterparts, advocating the respect for international humanitarian law, calling for protection of civilians, calling for respect of some of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, like the principle of proportionality and distinction between combatants and civilians. We have been calling for opening of additional crossing points, and so on, and so on. My next point is about UNRWA. No, we have not received any evidence supporting the allegations by Israel that UNRWA staff were involved in the terrible events on 7th of October. And to our knowledge, none of the donors, other donors, have received any evidence. But at any rate, as I said in my introduction, there has to be, at the end of the day, individual accountability for any violation of the principle of neutrality of UNRWA. And there must not be collective punishment. This is not the answer. And yes, UNRWA is irreplaceable. Who's saying that? Let me tell you who is saying that. All other UN agencies, active and present in the Gaza Strip, are saying that to us. The International Committee of Red Cross is saying that to us. The entire International Red Cross and Red Crescent family is saying that to us. And so do the international non-governmental organizations who are present in the Gaza Strip in these very difficult circumstances. All of them are telling us, no, we cannot possibly take over the role of UNRWA. All of them. Now, how to go ahead? Certainly we support the investigations that has been launched by UN Office for Internal Oversight Services. We support the launch of the independent review group led by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna. We will follow very closely. We will expect full transparency on part of the UNRWA, and we will act accordingly. But let me recall again our statement, the Commission statement of the 29th January, in which we stated very clearly the EU humanitarian aid will continue unabated. Finally, in closing, I wish to repeat that we need to define credible prospects for peace in the Middle East. We must relaunch a political process for a two-state solution. And that is the only solution that can bring sustainable peace and security to the region. As I said in my introduction, military solution does not exist. We have developed ideas to advance the objective of this two-state solution based on the Peace Day effort and on the support by the EU and others for holding an international peace conference soon. Because of the work we did prior to 7th of October, we are now in a good central place to take this work further. We are in close contacts with our partners, including Arab states, to work together to that end. And even when one or more of the parties are not yet ready, we have to prepare. We have to prepare the substance of a peace deal. We have to elaborate not only how we would support peace, but also what could be a concrete, time-bound framework for the peace between Israel and Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. So the debate is closed.